The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in September, tucked between a seed catalog and an electric bill, and it took Walter Kessler exactly 4 sentences to understand that the government intended to drown his family's farm. Notice of intent to acquire property by eminent domain. The words sat on the page like a verdict already handed down. 320 acres of bottom land along Cattaron Creek, land his grandfather had cleared with a mule, and a hand plow land that had fed 4 generations of Kesslers, was, according to the State Engineering Office, the single best location in the county for a new flood control reservoir. The Bellhaven Dam Project, they called it. A concrete wall 200 feet high, backing up 11 miles of water behind it, and Walter's home would sit at the bottom of that water like a coin dropped in a well. He read the letter twice at the kitchen table, and then he did something he hadn't done in 11 years. He walked down to the root cellar, moved aside 3 crates of canning jars, and pulled out his grandfather's cedar strongbox, the one nobody in the family had opened since the old man's funeral. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth gone brittle and yellow, were ledgers. Water-stained, ink-faded, handwritten ledgers, dated 1921. What Walter found in those pages that night would not just save his farm. It would expose a lie the state had been telling for 60 years, and it would prove that the ground they wanted to bury under a reservoir had already tried to kill 300 people once before. Cattaron County sat in the kind of country that photographed beautifully and farmed stubbornly. Rolling hills cut through by creek bottoms so rich with silt that corn grew taller there than anywhere else in the state, but land that flooded too. When the sky decided to empty itself all at once, Walter Kessler had grown up hearing his father say the bottom land was a gift and a gamble in the same breath. You got 3 extra bushels an acre for taking the risk. Sometimes the risk collected. The Kessler farm had been in the family since 1897, when Walter's great-grandfather, Ezra Kessler, bought the land from a railroad speculator who'd gone bankrupt trying to run a spur line through the valley. Ezra's son, Amos Kessler, Walter's grandfather, had been the one to really build the place. Amos had put in the barn that still stood, dug the well that still ran sweet, and as Walter would soon rediscover, kept a diary of the weather with the obsessive discipline of a man who had learned the hard way that weather was not something you could afford to trust. Walter was 53 years old, widowed 6 years, with a grown daughter, Renee, who taught high school biology 40 minutes away and came home most Sundays. He ran 200 head of cattle and rotated corn and soybeans on the bottom acres, and he had never once in his life imagined that the biggest fight of his existence would be against the government of the state he'd paid taxes to since he was 18. The letter named a public hearing 6 weeks out, where affected landowners could present testimony before the Bellhaven Dam Project's final route was certified by the State Water Resources Commission. 6 weeks. Walter had 6 weeks to save 320 acres and a house his daughter had been born in. He called the number on the letterhead the next morning. A man named Gerald Voss, identified as senior project engineer for the commission, answered on the 4th ring, his voice smooth with the particular patience of someone who has given the same explanation 100 times. "Mr. Kessler, I understand this is difficult news," Voss said. "But I want to assure you the site selection process was extremely rigorous. We looked at 11 possible locations along the Cattaron watershed. Your property sits at the optimal point, geologically stable, the right elevation gradient, minimal population displacement compared to the alternatives. This isn't a decision anyone made lightly. Geologically stable," Walter repeated. "You're telling me my land is the safest place to put a dam?" "That's correct." Walter thanked him and hung up, and something about the phrase kept snagging in his mind like a fishhook caught in cloth. Geologically stable. He wasn't an engineer. He didn't have the vocabulary to argue with a man who had a state office and a title. But he had something else. He had a grandfather who had walked that same creek bottom every single day of his adult life, and who had never once, in 40 years of casual conversation, called it stable. He remembered instead his grandfather standing on the porch in the rain, watching the creek climb the yard, muttering the same phrase every spring, "This ground remembers 1921. Walter had always assumed it was just an old man's superstition. That night he went looking for the truth. The root cellar smelled of dirt and old apples. Walter's flashlight beam swept over shelves of mason jars, his late wife Carol's tomatoes, his own half-hearted attempts at pickling, until it landed on the corner where a cedar strongbox sat beneath a folded canvas tarp, exactly where it had been since his grandfather's funeral in 2013. Nobody had touched it. There had never seemed to be a reason. The lock was rusted but gave easily to an old key Walter found still hanging on a nail by the cellar stairs, a key he hadn't thought about in over a decade. Inside, 3 leather-bound ledgers, a Kodak envelope of brittle photographs, a rolled county survey map gone soft at the folds, and a small bundle of letters tied with twine. Walter carried the whole box up to the kitchen table and under the yellow light of the overhead bulb began to read. The first ledger was dated 1918 to 1924, and it was, as Walter had expected, mostly weather. Rainfall in inches. Creek height measured against a stone Amos had marked at the old footbridge. Temperatures, planting dates. It was the record of a man who trusted numbers more than instinct, because numbers didn't change their story depending on how scared you were. Then Walter reached the entries for late March 1921 and the numbers stopped being routine. March 22, rain since Tuesday, no let-up. Creek at the bridge mark plus 6 inches, highest I have seen. March 24, creek over the bridge, water in the Hollies' lower field. Pa says the ridge above town won't hold if it keeps. March 26, dam broke at 4 in the morning, God help us, have not slept. 11 dead so far that we know of, more feared. Water came through the valley like the hand of the Lord, Pa said, and I believe him, having seen it. Our own house stood because we are higher than the Hollies' place, but the barn is gone and 6 cattle with it. Walter set the ledger down and sat very still. Dam broke, not a flood from rain alone, a dam. There had been a dam here before in 1921 and it had failed and people had died. Nobody in Walter's lifetime had ever mentioned this, not his father. Not the County Historical Society plaque outside the courthouse, which mentioned Cattaron County's founding, its role in a minor Civil War skirmish, and its prize-winning county fair, but nothing about a flood that had killed people in living memory of his own grandfather. He kept reading. The ledger, in the weeks after the disaster, turned into something closer to a journal, Amos processing what he'd witnessed in short, clipped entries. And it was there, in an entry dated April 9, 1921, that Walter found the sentence that would end up changing everything. Engineer from the state come through today asking questions about the old Millrace Dam, wanted to know had anyone noted cracks in the face before it went. I told him yes, I noted it myself in this book, 2 years running. He wrote nothing down that I saw. Said the county would issue its own report. I do not trust that report will say what we all watched with our own eyes. The old Millrace Dam, Walter had never heard the name. He would spend the next several days learning exactly why nobody had. Renee came home that Sunday to find her father surrounded by ledgers, survey maps, and a legal pad covered in his cramped handwriting, looking like a man who hadn't slept properly in 3 nights, which he hadn't. Dad, what is all this? Walter told her everything, the eminent domain letter, the 6-week hearing deadline, the cedar box, the 1921 flood, the Millrace Dam that nobody talked about anymore. Renee, sharper than her father in the way of someone who'd spent her adult life grading arguments for their logic rather than their volume, sat down and started reading the ledger herself. This says the dam had cracks that were reported before it failed, she said. That's not just there was a flood here once. That's negligence. That's exactly the kind of thing that would show up in a report. If there is a report, your grandfather says there was one, a county report. That's a public record, Dad, assuming it wasn't lost or destroyed. The next morning, father and daughter drove to the county courthouse together. The clerk's office directed them to the historical archive room in the basement, a space that hadn't been reorganized by the look of it since sometime in the Carter administration. It took 2 hours of searching through boxes labeled only by decade before Renee's fingers found a thin, water-stained folder marked Millrace Dam Incident, 1921, County Engineers Report. The report existed. 11 typed pages, plus 2 hand-drawn diagrams of the dam face and the surrounding rock strata. Walter's hands were unsteady as he turned to the conclusion. The failure of the Millrace impoundment on March 26, 1921, resulting in 11 confirmed fatalities, is attributable to structural undermining caused by unstable shale substrate beneath the western abutment. Fissuring in this stratum was documented by local residents as early as 1919. It is the recommendation of this office that no impoundment structure of significant height be constructed at this location in the future, as the underlying geology has been demonstrated, through catastrophic failure, to be inadequate to support sustained hydraulic pressure. Renee read it twice aloud, her voice going quieter with each sentence. Dad, this is it. This is the whole ballgame. The exact spot where they want to build the new dam, that's the Millrace site, isn't it? Walter pulled out the rolled survey map from his grandfather's box and unrolled it beside a photocopy of the state's proposed reservoir footprint, which he'd printed from the Water Resources Commission's website the night before. He laid one over the other, angling the old map against a window to line up the creek bend and the ridgeline. They matched, not approximately, almost exactly. The western edge of the state's proposed dam wall sat within a few hundred yards of where the old Millrace structure had stood. On the very ground the 1921 report had explicitly warned should never again support a dam. They said it was the most geologically stable site in the valley, Walter said. Either they don't know about this report, Renee said, or they do know and they're hoping nobody else finds out. Walter requested a follow-up meeting with Gerald Voss, this time in person, bringing Renee along and copies of both the ledger pages and the county report. They met in a state office building 40 minutes from the farm, in a conference room with a laminate table and a framed photograph of a different, already completed dam hanging crookedly on the wall. Voss received the documents with visible discomfort. He read the county report slowly, his jaw tightening by the second page. Where did you get this? He asked finally. County Archive, it's a public record, Renee said, filed and indexed under the historical incidents category, anyone could have pulled it. Our geological survey for this project was conducted 18 months ago, Voss said, a little too quickly. Core samples, seismic testing, the works. If there were a documented structural failure at this exact site, our survey team would have what? Walter said, found it. Or looked for it. Voss didn't have a ready answer for that, and the silence in the room said more than his next several sentences would. He eventually admitted that the Commission's geological survey had used modern satellite-referenced substrate mapping, cross-checked against the state's own historical incident database. A database that, as it turned out, only went back to 1948, the year the state had standardized its record-keeping system. Anything before that, including an inconvenient dam collapse in 1921, existed only in county-level paper archives that nobody at the state level was under any obligation to consult. So your rigorous process, Walter said, never actually looked. I'll need to bring this to my supervisors, Voss said, which both Kesslers understood to mean I don't know what happens now and I am scared to find out. Walter drove home that evening with a feeling he hadn't expected, not triumph, not yet, but something steadier. For the first time since the letter arrived, he wasn't just a man about to lose his farm. He was a man holding proof. It did not go quietly. Word travels fast in a county the size of Cattaron, and within a week, Walter learned that the Bellhaven Dam Project had powerful friends. A regional water authority had already lined up federal flood mitigation funding contingent on the project moving forward on schedule. A downstream township, Marsh Fork, had been promised the dam as protection against flooding that had plagued them for decades, and their town council had been vocal, at public meetings, about wanting the project finished, meaning that Walter Kessler wasn't just fighting an engineer anymore. He was about to be painted, to an entire community's face, as the selfish farmer standing between them and safety. The first sign of the fight to come arrived as a phone call from a woman named Diane Petrakis, who introduced herself as a project liaison and suggested, in tones so pleasant they curdled, that Walter might want to consider the goodwill value of cooperating early before the acquisition process became more formal. The implication that resisting now would cost him later, in compensation or otherwise, was not subtle. Then came the county paper, the Cattaron Sentinel, running a front-page piece titled "Bellhaven Dam Faces Local Opposition," that quoted an anonymous Water Resources Commission source describing isolated concerns from a single landowner being weighed against the flood safety of thousands. Walter's name wasn't printed, but everyone in the county knew whose bottom land the state wanted, and by the following Sunday he was fielding uncomfortable looks at the feed store. Renee, for her part, had gone further than her father knew. A former college roommate now worked as a paralegal for a small environmental law firm 2 counties over, and Renee had sent her scanned copies of the ledger and the county report the same night they'd found them. The firm called back within 4 days. They think we have a case, Renee told her father, not just for compensation, for stopping the project outright at this location. If the geological hazard is documented and the state's own survey failed to account for it, that's potentially a violation of their own siting regulations, not to mention a serious public safety issue if they build anyway. Can we afford lawyers, Renee? The firm does some cases on contingency when the public interest angle is strong enough. Dad, a 100-year-old cover-up of a fatal dam collapse on the exact site they want to flood again, that's about as strong as public interest gets. 2 weeks before the hearing, Walter drove out to see Iris Hollies. She was 91 years old, the last living descendant of the Hollies family whose lower field had flooded first in 1921, and she still lived, stubbornly and alone, in a small house up the ridge from where the old homestead had stood. Walter hadn't spoken to her in years beyond a wave across a church parking lot, but when he called ahead and mentioned the ledgers, she told him to come by that afternoon and bring the coffee, because hers had gone stale. Iris remembered things Amos Kessler's ledger hadn't recorded, because she'd heard them straight from her own grandmother, who had survived the flood as a girl of 9. My grandmother used to say the water came so fast there wasn't even time to cry out a warning, Iris said, her voice steady despite the subject. She said afterward, men from the state came and took photographs and asked questions and then just left, never came back. Never told anybody what they found. My grandmother always believes they knew the dam had cracks before it broke and built it anyway, because the county wanted the mill running before winter. Did she ever say anything about them knowing beforehand? Anything I could use? Iris rose slowly, walked to an old sideboard and returned with a small tin box of her own. Every family in this valley, it seemed, had a box like this, Walter thought, a private ledger of grief nobody talked about until someone came asking. Inside were photographs, the broken dam face, rescue workers along the creek, and one image that made Walter's chest tighten, a crowd gathered at a gravesite, 11 wooden markers in a row, dated April 1921. You should take these to your hearing, Iris said. Somebody ought to finally answer for it. I won't live forever, Mr. Kessler, but I'd like to see this town admit what happened before I go. The Water Resources Commission's public hearing was held in the county fairgrounds event hall, the only room in Cattaron County large enough to hold the crowd that showed up. Farmers Marsh Fork residents anxious about flood protection, reporters from 2 regional stations, and seated near the front in a gray suit that looked freshly pressed for the occasion. Gerald Voss beside 2 commissioners Walter had never met. Walter had never spoken in front of more than a church congregation in his life. His hands shook as Renee squeezed his arm at the podium and whispered, "Just tell them what's in the box, Dad. That's all you have to do." He began with his grandfather's name. He read aloud the March 26, 1921 entry, "The water coming through the valley like the hand of the Lord." He held up the county report, page by page, reading the conclusion that no impoundment of significant height should ever again be built on that ground. He set beside it the state's current proposed reservoir footprint, overlaid on his grandfather's 1921 survey map, so the audience could see with their own eyes how closely the boundaries matched. And then he held up Iris Hollis's photograph, 11 wooden grave markers, and let the silence in the room do work no argument of his could have done. "The state calls this location the most geologically stable site in the valley," Walter said, his voice finally steady. "My grandfather called it ground that remembers 1921. I'm asking this commission to explain to the people of Marsh Fork and to the memory of 11 people who died right here why anyone thought it was wise to forget." Voss was called to respond. To his credit, and Walter would say later that this was the one moment he respected the man, Voss did not try to argue the report was wrong. He acknowledged on record that the commission's substrate survey had not included pre-1948 county archives. That this was a gap in the current review protocol, and that the documents presented that day raised legitimate and serious questions that the commission has an obligation to formally investigate before certifying any final route. The chair of the commission, a retired judge named Corinne Acre, did not rule that day. But she ordered an independent geological review of the Millrace site, incorporating the 1921 county report and Amos Kessler's original ledger observations, before any further certification could proceed. And she said, on the public record, that the commission would revisit alternative sites along the Cattaron watershed in the meantime. The independent review took 4 months. Walter spent them the way he'd spent every autumn of his life, harvesting corn and soybeans off the same bottom land the state had briefly intended to bury, uncertain in the early weeks whether he'd get to plant it again come spring. The geological team that came out in November drilled test cores at the old Millrace site and found exactly what the 1921 report had warned about: a shale stratum beneath the western abutment zone, weathered and fissured, structurally unsuited to the sustained hydraulic load of a modern high dam. Their report, released in January, did not merely echo the century-old finding. It stated plainly that had the original 1921 report been consulted during the initial site survey, the Millrace location would never have advanced past the earliest screening stage. The Bellhaven Dam Project was formally relocated to a site 9 miles upstream, on stabler ground, with a smaller footprint that spared not only the Kessler farm but 4 other homesteads that would otherwise have been condemned. Marsh Fork got its flood protection. Nobody had to drown a graveyard, literal or otherwise, to get it. At the courthouse, at Renee's quiet insistence, the County Historical Society finally added a plaque beside the one commemorating the fair and the Civil War skirmish. It read simply, "In memory of the 11 lives lost in the Millrace Dam failure March 26, 1921. Their story was nearly forgotten. It will not be forgotten again." Iris Hollis was there when they unveiled it, 92 years old by then, leaning on Walter's arm. "My grandmother would have liked this," she said, somebody finally listening to the ground. Walter Kessler kept farming the bottom land his great-grandfather had cleared with a mule, the land his grandfather had watched flood in 1921, and had never stopped warning his family about in a language they hadn't known how to read until it was almost too late. The cedar strongbox went back into the root cellar, but Walter moved it to a shelf where he'd see it every time he walked down for jars. A reminder that the people who came before you sometimes leave you exactly what you need, you just have to be willing to open the box. Some inheritances aren't land or money or even memory. Sometimes they're a warning, written in a shaking hand, waiting 100 years for someone who finally needed to hear it.